Well, we are in the second week of a sermon series titled You Asked It. And what we're doing in this series is I'm responding to some of the questions that you all have asked. Last week, I responded to the most popular and compelling question by far, which was, why do bad things happen to good people? If you missed that message, I encourage you to go onto our website or our YouTube page and watch it. We actually also post audio versions of the messages. You can find those through podcast providers, so you can listen to it on your way to work or while you're working out or doing work in the home. So that's all available for you. Today, we're going to deal with a question that wasn't one of the most popular, but I think it's an absolutely necessary question for us to deal with, especially at the beginning here. And the question is this: what historical evidence is there for Jesus? Because you see, if you become a disciple of Jesus, if you decide that you want to follow Jesus, or if you're even curious, at some point in time, either you're going to ask this question personally, or somebody is going to ask you this question. And it's a good question to ask, because if you start to read about Jesus, you'll read about how he walked on water, how he turned water into wine, how he raised a girl from the dead, he raised Lazarus from the dead, he's raised from the dead, and there's some things that for a modern scientific mind, it's kind of hard to believe. And it's easy to quickly think that because there's parts of this that are a little bit hard for us to believe from our historical stance, that maybe all of it is make-believe. In fact, some really smart people think that it's all make-believe. One of my good friends, a very smart person, said to me over Thanksgiving, he said, there's really no evidence for Jesus, so I don't really get why you're into this, Scott. And he's wrong, because there is evidence. A lot of times we don't really look at it. So I'm going to share some of that evidence with you today, and this is going to be a little bit like a lecture in history, a little academic, but there's a goal here. So like if you like history, today's for you. If you don't, hang with me, because there's a really, really important and simple goal. And the goal is this: I want to help build your confidence in Jesus. I want to help build your confidence in Jesus so that at some point, hopefully soon, you take a personal, direct look at this person. That you begin to think it's foolish to ignore this person, Jesus. You know, when I was in college, I started to read the Gospels for myself. And the reasons I read the Gospel is not because I was really interested in Jesus. Rather, I was starting to actually go to class and actually go to the library, so I was getting better grades, and I was beginning to be attracted to women who were into guys who were smart. And so I thought, if I'm going to be smart, I need to know something about this Jesus guy, because I was in philosophy, in sociology, and that sort of thing. And the Bible, really, historically, it has influenced so much of Western civilization. So I started to look at the person of Jesus. I started to read the Gospels, and something happened when I read the stories. When I took a look at it for myself, I thought I knew all about Jesus. I grew up in the church. But when I read it for myself, something happened. I want to build your confidence in Jesus a little bit today, so that maybe you might take that personal look yourself as an adult. So I want to introduce you to three people: Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, and Josephus. Could everybody say Tacitus with me? Tacitus, okay? Tacitus was a Roman senator. He was also a historian. He writes towards the end of the first century. He wrote a famous work called the Annals. And in the Annals, that's where we learned a lot about the early emperors in the first century. So Caesar Augustus, Nero, some of those other emperors in the first part of the first century. And if you were to study Roman history, actually, if you take it a step forward and you were to study about how we know what we think we know about Roman history, you would encounter Tacitus. He is super important in terms of what we know about early Roman history. Now, he was not a Christian. In fact, he did not think highly of Christians. And you'll see that in a moment. But he does mention Christians in his writings. And here's an excerpt of one of his writings from the Annals. He says, Nero, who was an emperor in the 60s, Nero fastened the guilt on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. You might already know that Christians originally was a derogatory term assigned to a group of people who called themselves something else. They called themselves followers of the way, because Jesus spoke about this way that leads to true life. But some people came along and they said, we're just going to call these guys Christians. And Tacitus, at the end of the first century, he's aware of this. Nero fastened the guilt on a class called Christians. Now, what was the guilt? It had to do with a fire in Rome, the city of Rome, in 64 AD. The rumor was that Nero actually set the fire himself because he wanted to clear out that land to build a section of his palace, which he eventually does. But Nero was smart enough to know that he can't let rumor just continue to grow, so he puts the blame on a group of Christians. He rounds some of them up, binds them together, puts them into his Colosseum, brings a lion or a bear in, and they're literally fed to the lions and the bears. They had to fight them off, and people watched for entertainment. Some of them were put up on stakes and lit on fire and used to light the courts of Nero's palace. Nero was a psychopath. Tacitus doesn't like him. He doesn't treat him very well, but he does mention this. He goes on to say, next screen, Christus, which would be Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius, another emperor in the 30s, at the hands of Pontius Pilate. Some of you have heard of Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition. He goes on, but I love it. He calls Christianity a mischievous superstition. Now, what's the extreme penalty? Anybody have any idea? The cross. We have plenty of evidence that the Romans crucified all sorts of people. There's this guy Spartacus from another period of time who was a slave that revolted against the Roman Empire. And when Spartacus's rebellion was finally squashed by the Roman Empire, they killed him and then they crucified something like 800 of his followers along the Appian Way, which is in the Roman Empire. And Tacitus, non-Christian, outside the Bible, mentions Pontius Pilate and the crucifixion. Let's move on to Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger was a governor, and he had this problem on his hands because he had this group of followers of the way, this group that they called Christians, and he writes to the Emperor Trajan. This is around 120, and we have manuscripts, which are copies of the original thing, from both Pliny the Younger and Emperor Trajan. They have this correspondence. And we don't know exactly what these Christians are doing in Pliny the Younger's territory, but we do know that being a Christian at that point in time was enough to get arrested and even punished or put to death. But it's a problem. And we'll see why, because look at how Pliny describes the Christians. He says this, they were in the habit of meeting on certain fixed days before it was light. Why are they meeting so early? Well, because it's dangerous to be a Christian. When they sang an alternate verse, a hymn to Christ as to a God, they're singing to this guy like he's a God, and bound themselves by solemn oath, now next part's important, not to wicked deeds, because the accusation is that this mischievous superstition was full of wicked deeds. Rather, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, and he goes on to list a bunch of terrible things that these Christians have an oath not to do. The problem is that they're too dang good, but we don't like them. It was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. You know what one of the top accusations of Christians was in the first century? They were cannibals, flesh eaters. Why would anybody think that Christians were cannibals? Well, it has to do with what we did last week. We take a piece of bread, we say, this is the body of Christ, take and eat it. Cannibals, okay? This is wine, this is actually blood, drink it. Cannibals, they could have think we were vampires or something. And he says, look, I've looked at these people, they've taken this oath, plus the food they eat, they're not cannibals. There's still a problem. That's Pliny the Younger. Josephus, he is not a Roman official, rather he's Jewish, and he is a famous Jewish historian. He wrote a work called the Antiquities. And in the Antiquities, there's several references. One is to James, the brother of Jesus. James and Jesus are mentioned in that passage. There's another reference to John the Baptist and his murder by King Herod. We talked about that last week, remember? John the Baptist loses his head because he's talking smack about Herodias, Herod's wife. And then there's this one passage that we're going to look at. And this is really, really important in terms of understanding history and what we know and how we can know it. So here's what he says. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who performed surprising deeds. He was the Christ. Now, Josephus is Jewish, and scholars tend to think that this is an authentic passage. We don't have the original copy. This is a manuscript. It's a copy of a copy of a copy. They think it's authentic, but they think that some Christians came along later and they added a few parts. Any guesses to what those parts might be? He was the Christ. It is unlikely that Josephus, a Jew, would write that, because as a Jew, if he believed that Jesus was the Christ, he would no longer be a Jew. He would be a Christian. So we think that that's added later. And here's the point. Here's what I don't want you to miss. History is messy. History is really messy. And the farther back you go, the less we can know with absolute clarity. And so that's why I believe that we have evidence and theories. We do not have proof. We don't have proof. And the farther back you go, the more murky it becomes. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But history is far more messy than we would like it to be. We wish we had it on film. But the truth is, and we know this, that even with film, you can edit film. You can distort film. We see that right now in our political sphere. History is messy. We have evidence, and we have lots of evidence. And we have theories, and some theories are way better than others because they have more evidence. But we don't have proof, whichever side of the argument you're on. Back to Josephus. The rest of the passage, it says Pilate, there's Pilate again, okay, Pontius Pilate, had condemned him to a cross, a reference to the crucifixion again. Those who had first come to love him did not cease. Now that first part seems to be historically accurate, right? We have several references to Pilate and the crucifixion. And then that second part, they didn't stop loving him. Well, we're still here, aren't we? So there's lots of evidence for that. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life. Again, probably an edit. History is messy. We have evidence in theory. We don't have proof. That doesn't mean that we can't have confidence, because already we got Tacitus and Pliny the Younger and Josephus. I didn't talk about Suetonius, I didn't talk about Lucian or the Babylonian Talmud, which all have references to Jesus and the early Christian movement outside of the Scripture. The point is this. There is sufficient historical evidence, not proof, sufficient historical evidence for the existence of Jesus. What about miracles and all that sort of thing? That's not the discussion we're having. We're just making a baseline that this Jesus person existed, people knew about him, and he impacted culture and had a movement that was very, very, very real. And this is all outside the Bible. But I would argue that we also have the 27 books of the New Testament, which is not a book. Rather, this is 27 historical documents that should be considered as part of the evidence. A lot of times, the New Testament gets pushed to the side because they're like, hey, those writers had an agenda. You don't think that Tacitus had an agenda in the way that he wrote? Josephus clearly has an agenda. These are historical documents. There's 8, maybe 9 or more authors that make up these 27 books. There is sufficient historical evidence for the existence of Jesus. To claim otherwise is pretty foolish. It reveals you really don't know the history. Does that mean he is who the New Testament says he is? Of course not. That's a whole different discussion. But we have a strong, strong baseline from history. All right. Now it's time to bring you back to high school. Who here remembers Homer's Iliad? All right, come on. Who's seen the Brad Pitt movie about Troy? Okay, yeah. Now everybody knows what we're talking about. Yeah, Homer's Iliad, okay. Homer's Iliad is thought to have been written around 800 BCE or BC. That just means before the Common Era. It's an updated way of saying it. That's pretty old. And the oldest manuscript is thought to be written around 400 BCE. Now that is incredible that we have that document. But it's a 400-year gap. Just think about the things that have changed in America in 400 years. What was America like 400 years ago? There was no America, right? Like it hadn't even been created as a country yet. That's the time gap. Yet, we have 1,700 manuscripts. Homer's Iliad has the second largest collection of manuscripts when it comes to ancient documents. And for that reason, scholars tend to think that when you read Homer's Iliad, you have an authentic representation of the culture of that time. It's a story, but it tells you something accurate about the people and the way they thought and the way they tell stories. Now, how many of you, by show of hands, know who Tacitus is? You should all raise your hand because we just talked about Tacitus. Yeah, you said his name, okay? All right, Tacitus's Annals, that was thought to be written around 100 CE, and there's actually 2 volumes. The earliest volume that we have, the earliest manuscript, is 850 CE, 750-year difference. If you read about Roman history and how we know what we think we know, you will encounter Tacitus. He's key to our understanding to Roman history, and there's a 750-year gap between when he wrote and the earliest document. And altogether, we have something like 33 manuscripts. 33 manuscripts. And Tacitus is considered a very, very reliable source for history. Gives us good evidence. New Testament, that was written between the years 50 and 100. Scholars debate. There's all sorts of glorious debate about exactly when all these documents are from. Paul's letters are earliest, then probably Mark. Revelation is probably clearly towards the end. But 50 to 100 CE. And the earliest document we have is actually from 130 CE. It's a copy or a fragment from the Gospel of John, John 18. John was thought to be written maybe in the 80s, 90s. So think about that. It's a 40, 50-year difference. Way better than Iliad, way better than Tacitus. And I looked up, I was like, what's John 18 about? And John 18 is about this trial with this guy, Pontius Pilate. Have you heard of him? And Jesus is in front of Pontius Pilate, and the accusation that the Jews had made against Jesus, they want to get him crucified. So there was one thing that could get you crucified, and that's claiming to be a king. You're a threat to the Roman Empire. So Pontius Pilate, he's like, are you the king? And Jesus says, you said so. And then he says this, hold it for a second, Matt. He says this, and this blew me away because remember, our conversation today is all around, is there a historical reliability to the story of Jesus? Is this thing true? Can we believe it? Look what Jesus says. In fact, the reason I was born and came into this world is to testify to the truth. And everyone on the side of truth listens to me. What is truth? Retorts Pilate. Maybe I'm just a total nerd, but when I found out that this was the earliest document, it almost blew me out of my seat. I just found that ironic and amazing. What is truth? Well, that's what we're trying to establish by looking at the evidence. And this is the earliest document. It just happens to be the earliest document. We have coincidence, a little God wink, whatever your theology orientation is. I just thought that was remarkable. We have 5,795 Greek manuscripts. It's also been translated into the Coptic language, into the Syriac, and all sorts of other translations. We have way, way more than that. But just Greek, the primary language of the New Testament, there's 5,795. The point is this: the New Testament has more and earlier manuscripts than any other collection of ancient documents. Does that make it true? Of course not. But that's the historical context in which this all comes from. Now, the best evidence is not in this. Rather, it has to do with this. So you have 27 books of the New Testament. The red are the Gospels, and there's 4 of them. You have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're called the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic Gospels. You don't have to remember that, but here's what you should remember. The 3 of them follow basically the same timeline, the same chronology, and they have a lot of the same details, a lot of characteristics in common. But John is an outlier. It's written way later. And I'll never forget when I was in college and I was beginning to read the text for myself as an adult. I read Matthew, and I got through these stories. A lot of them were familiar from my childhood, but it was different as an adult. And I'm getting this sense of who this Jesus is. He's nonviolent, and he's like courageous, and like it's just amazing how he stands up to power. But then he comes to the temple, and he loses his mind, and he starts turning over tables, and he like makes a whip, and he's just so upset when he sees how the religious people of the day had corrupted the religion and had guilted and scared people into giving their money. And it was a racket. Jesus was not having it. It was like this climax of the story, right? I mean, it's like that part of the movie you just can't help but to remember. And it blew me away. And then eventually I got to reading the Gospel of John. And in the second chapter, there's 21 chapters in the Gospel of John, the second chapter, there's Jesus turning over tables in the temple. And I'm like, whoa, hold on. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it comes at the end of the story. But in John, it comes at the beginning of the story. And that really freaked me out. How can I believe this stuff? It doesn't even agree with each other. But here's what I've learned, and here's what's super important about this. John's purpose is not to write an accurate and exhaustive history of the life of Jesus. That's what we want him to do. That's what we assume makes it truthful. But John, he is not intending to write an accurate, meaning like all the details fit together just how they happen, and exhaustive. I got everything that ever happened in here. That's not what he's trying to do. This isn't modern news story, who, what, when, where, why, how, that sort of thing. It's something different. Well, what's John's purpose? Well, he tells us. First, he says, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. Hey, John, did you know that Jesus did this and it's not your book? Yeah. Well, don't you think you should put it in there? No. Right? There's all sorts of things that Jesus did that are not in his book, and John is forthright about that. It's like, I am not trying to write an exhaustive account of the history of Jesus. What are you trying to do, John? He says, these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. This is all written and constructed and reconfigured and chose deliberately for this purpose, that you might believe and that it might impact your life. And you think, well, I know people that believe this stuff, and I look at their life, and I don't want that life. And John would say, yeah, I understand that. But I'm talking about you. Have you ever looked at this? Have you ever looked at John's argument and understood kind of what's going on beneath the surface? Not just like a surface level reading like a kid would read, but like as an adult, understanding there's symbolism and there's metaphor. It's a complex, sophisticated adult book, and people study it for years and still don't grasp the depths of it. That's just one of these 27 books. It's amazing. Have you really done that? And then we can tell if you are getting it by how your life is transformed. It will impact your life. And you know some people that when things get really, really bad, they're able to somehow be resilient. They're able to somehow still have joy. They're able to somehow forgive something you could never forgive. They're able to somehow live with like this lightness and the sense of grace in a world that is pretty broken. It's full of a lot of disappointment. It will impact your life. And I talk to a lot of people and they're like, well, I know about Jesus and all that and everything. I'm like, really? Do you? Because I think that the best evidence for the existence of Jesus is actually the story of his existence. But do you know the story? You know of it, but do you really know it? That's why next week we're going to look through the Gospel of John, or the Gospel of Luke. We're going to spend some time using the Bible Project. It's never been easier to learn the story of his existence, to understand how these kind of weird stories about a healing here and this Pharisee over there and things that are just out of our cultural context, how they fit together and actually provide a way to look at your life in this world that is helpful, that changes things. And is there historical evidence for the life of Jesus? Absolutely. There's plenty of historical evidence. Is it proof? Nobody's claiming that. But the best thing for the argument for Jesus is when you begin to know his story and you understand his teachings and the teachings of his life. How his life teaches us something about how to be. So here's what I suggest you do. Learn the story. Learn the story. You're all adults. This is not Sunday school. This is not like, kids' hour. It's complex. It's difficult at times, but you can learn it. People do, and it's never, ever been easier. The Bible Project helps with that. The Bible app that Angie mentioned. If you want a flesh and blood Bible, just reach forward and take the one from the pew or go to my office. You can have any one that I have there. Just take it. You don't even have to ask. You can learn the story, and it will make a difference. It would be foolish. It would be foolish because of the evidence that's there and the opportunity to not actually take a personal, thoughtful look at this yourself. Let us pray. God, we thank you for Tacitus and Pliny and Josephus and Suetonius and Lucian, the Babylonian Talmud. We thank you for the 27 documents that come together to form what we call the New Testament. But there were documents written by original people expressing how they understood reality, how they understood the significance of this historical figure, Jesus. We might have been told things when we were younger. We might think that we kind of know all there is to know. But God, I pray for each person here that we begin a relationship with Christ through the Scriptures, through a relationship with one another. For John says, that's the purpose, to come to know him as who he is. That's going to give us real life. In Christ's name we pray.